The morning of May 3rd, 1942, Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company, Kearney, New Jersey. A welder named Thomas Patterson stands before the skeletal framework of what will become USS Nicholas, hull number DD-449. In his hands, an acetylene torch. In front of him, a 3-ton gun mount waiting to be fused to the destroyer's forward deck. The official United States Navy Bureau of Ships Manual, Specification Revision 14-A, states that this installation requires 16 separate welds, performed in strict sequence, with mandatory 4-hour cooling periods between each phase. Total time required, 48 hours, minimum. Patterson lights his torch. 11 minutes later, the gun mount is locked in place, solid, permanent, structurally sound, completely unauthorized. Within 6 months, variations of his technique will slash destroyer production time by more than half. Within 18 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy will face a numerical impossibility, American destroyers multiplying faster than they can be sunk. But in this moment, Thomas Patterson is simply a man with rough hands and a theory about metal, standing in violation of every approved construction protocol the United States Navy has established over 166 years of shipbuilding. The question this story asks is not whether rules should be broken, it's whether the people writing the rules ever asked the people doing the work. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Thomas Patterson did and why it mattered, you must first understand the crisis American shipbuilding faced in the winter of 1941. December 7th, 1941, changed every calculation the United States military had made about industrial warfare. When Pearl Harbor burned, the Navy lost or damaged 18 ships. But the real catastrophe wasn't what sank in Hawaiian waters. It was what existed, or rather didn't exist, in American shipyards. On the day America entered World War II, the United States Navy operated 347 commissioned vessels. The Imperial Japanese Navy operated 541. More critically, Japan possessed a qualitative advantage in the vessel type that would determine control of the Pacific, the destroyer. Japanese destroyers were faster, better armed, and more numerous than anything the United States had in the water. The Fubuki-class destroyers that Japan had been producing since 1927 could make 38 knots faster than most American destroyers could manage, even in ideal conditions. Their Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes had a range of 40,000 yards. American Mark 15 torpedoes, 15,000 yards. The mathematics was brutal. Using conventional shipbuilding methods, established in the 1920s and refined through the 1930s, American shipyards could produce one Fletcher-Class destroyer, the new standard that would supposedly match Japanese capabilities in approximately 5 to 6 months from keel laying to launch. At that rate, accounting for the time needed to train crews and conduct shakedown cruises, the United States would achieve naval parity with Japan sometime in mid-1947. This assumed Japan built nothing new, lost nothing in combat, and politely waited. The Navy needed destroyers, not eventually, now, dozens of them. The entire American strategy in the Pacific Island hopping campaigns, supply line protection, submarine screening, shore bombardment, depended on having enough destroyers to be in multiple places simultaneously. Without them, every amphibious operation became a calculated risk, every supply convoy became vulnerable, every carrier task force operated with insufficient protection. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, stated the problem with characteristic bluntness in a January 1942 memo to the Bureau of Ships. We are losing the tonnage war before it has properly begun. If current production rates continue, we will lack the vessels necessary to execute approved war plans by a factor of approximately 40%. This is unacceptable. The Bureau of Ships responded the way military bureaucracies typically respond to impossible demands. They requested increased funding, additional shipyard capacity, and more workers, all of which would take time to materialize. Time measured in years. What they got instead was a Pennsylvania-born welder with an 8th-grade education and a dangerous habit of ignoring instructions. Thomas Patterson was born in 1898 in the Lawrenceville neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father worked at Jones and Laughlin Steel. His mother took in laundry. Patterson left school at age 13 to work as a rivet heater in the same mill where his father spent 60-hour weeks feeding blast furnaces. This was not unusual. In working-class Pittsburgh in 1911, child labor wasn't a social problem, it was economic necessity. Patterson learned welding by watching older men work. This was before formal apprenticeship programs, before vocational schools offered certification courses. You learned by standing close enough to see but far enough not to get hit when something went wrong. You learned by trying, failing, and trying again until your welds held. You learned because if you didn't learn, you didn't eat. By 1917, when America entered the First World War, Patterson was 19 years old and one of the fastest welders at Jones and Laughlin. He had rough hands, a reputation for finishing work ahead of schedule, and a developing theory about metal that contradicted everything he'd been taught. The theory was this: metal has memory. Heat it wrong, and it remembers. The stress remains, invisible, waiting for the moment of maximum load to reveal itself, through catastrophic failure. But heat it correctly, understanding not just temperature but sequence, not just fusion but flow, and you could make the metal cooperate instead of fighting you. This wasn't metallurgical science. Patterson didn't know the terms crystalline structure or thermal expansion coefficient. What he knew was observation. He'd watched 15 years of welds crack, warp, and fail. He'd watched other welds hold under conditions that should have destroyed them. And he'd started to see patterns that the engineering manuals didn't mention. The manuals said, weld in sequence, allow cooling, proceed to next joint. This prevented warping. This was gospel. Patterson thought, what if the warping itself could be used? What if, instead of fighting the metal's tendency to bend under heat, you choreographed multiple welds so their stresses cancelled each other out? He tried it in small ways, a bracket here, a frame junction there. The work held, more than held, it seemed stronger. But Patterson was a floor worker, not an engineer. His job was to follow specifications, not question them, so he filed the observation away and kept welding the approved way. That changed when Federal Shipbuilding started hiring. Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company occupied 100 acres of industrial waterfront in Kearny, New Jersey, just across the Hackensack River from Newark. Founded in 1917 to build cargo ships for the First World War, the yard had spent the 1920s and 30s building commercial vessels, tankers, freighters, the occasional passenger liner, profitable work but modest in scale. That changed in 1939 when the Navy, reading the trajectory of European politics, began expanding destroyer construction. Federal Shipbuilding received contracts for 6 Fletcher-Class destroyers, then 12. Then, after Pearl Harbor, an open-ended contract, build as many, and as possible, as fast as possible, until further notice. The yard exploded. Employment went from 3,000 workers in January 1941 to 14,000 by June 1942. Patterson arrived in March 1941, one of hundreds of welders recruited from steel mills across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Men who knew heavy industrial work, men who understood that when metal was involved, theory and practice didn't always align. The Navy brought theory. Lots of it. The Bureau of Ships didn't just provide blueprints for Fletcher-Class destroyers. They provided detailed construction manuals specifying every phase of assembly. Hull plating, sequence A through M, with mandatory 8-hour intervals between stages. Superstructure assembly, deck by deck, fore to aft, with stress testing after each level. Weapons installation, mount, test, calibrate, in that order, with documentation at every step. The procedures were based on decades of shipbuilding experience and sound engineering principles. Ships are complex structures operating in hostile environments. Saltwater corrodes, wave action stresses, combat damage tests every joint. The Navy's conservative approach to construction had produced reliable vessels for generations. They had every reason to believe their methods were optimal. They also had every reason to be wrong. The engineering principles underlying Navy construction procedures were developed for hand-riveted steel plate construction, the dominant technique from the 1880s through the 1920s. But by 1942, welding had largely replaced riveting. Welding created different stress patterns, different failure modes, different possibilities. The Navy's engineers understood this in theory. Their manuals included extensive welding specifications, temperature ranges, electrode types, joint preparations, cooling rates. What they didn't account for was the tacit knowledge, possessed by men who'd spent 20 years watching metal behave in ways that contradicted engineering predictions. Men like Thomas Patterson. Patterson worked second shift, 4 p.m. to midnight. This timing mattered. First shift, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., crawled with Navy inspectors, men in clean coveralls carrying clipboards, checking every weld against specification sheets, rejecting work that deviated from approved procedures. Second shift had fewer inspectors. The ones who remained were tired, focused on major violations, less likely to scrutinize minor procedural variations. This created space for experimentation. Patterson started small. A gun mount installation that the manual specified required 12 hours. He completed it in 7, using simultaneous welds on opposite sides of the mounting ring. The stresses cancelled out. No warping. The inspector, arriving at midnight to check the day's work, saw a properly installed gun mount. He stamped the approval form and moved on. A bulkhead section that required 3 days of sequential welding. Patterson's crew finished it in 36 hours, using a radial pattern that distributed heat evenly across the entire structure. Again, no warping, no stress cracks, no visible deviation from specification. Approved. Forward deck plating. Manual said 12 separate sessions with cooling periods. Patterson's method, 4 sessions, using calculated simultaneous welds that created offsetting thermal expansion. Time saved, 16 hours. Quality. Inspector couldn't tell the difference. Patterson didn't think of this as innovation. He thought of it as common sense, the kind that comes from watching metal every day for 2 decades. But he was careful. He documented nothing. He taught his method only to welders he trusted, men who'd worked steel mills, and understood that sometimes the rules make sense on paper and nowhere else. By October 1941, 7 welders at Federal Shipbuilding were using Patterson's techniques. By January 1942, 23. By March, 71. The Navy noticed. Not the technique, the results. USS O'Bannon, DD-450, launched from Federal Shipbuilding on March 1, 1942. Time from keel laying to launch, 147 days. The contract specified 180 days. Federal was 33 days ahead of schedule. USS Nicholas, DD-449, laid down May 3rd. The production schedule called for launch in early November, 184 days. Patterson's crew was assigned to the forward section. They used every shortcut, every simultaneous welding pattern, every stress-cancelling technique Patterson had developed. Nicholas launched June 27th, 85 days after keel laying, 99 days ahead of schedule. The Navy inspectors were baffled. The construction logs showed all procedures followed correctly. The quality control tests showed structural integrity exceeding minimum specifications, but the timeline made no sense. Ships didn't get built this fast, not without cutting corners, not without hidden defects that would reveal themselves catastrophically 6 months into combat operations. An investigation was ordered. April 14, 1942. Thomas Patterson received a summons to report to the yard superintendent's office at 9 a.m. This was unusual. Second shift welders didn't have 9 a.m. meetings. Patterson asked what it was about. The foreman said he didn't know, but Patterson should probably bring his union representative. Patterson arrived to find 6 men waiting: the yard superintendent, the chief engineer, 2 naval inspectors from the Bureau of Ships, a commander from the Navy's Material Division in Washington, and a stenographer to record the conversation. On the desk, a stack of construction logs from USS Nicholas. Also on the desk, Metallurgical test results from weld samples taken from the completed hull. The lead inspector, a lieutenant commander named Morrison, opened a folder and read from a typed sheet. Mr. Patterson, our records indicate you were primary welder on 17 separate installation phases during the construction of USS Nicholas. Is that correct? Patterson confirmed it was. And you supervised or trained approximately 12 other welders during this period? Yes. Morrison slid a construction log across the desk. Can you explain why the time recorded for forward gun mount installation is 11 hours, when Bureau Specification 17A, Section 4, Subsection 12, explicitly requires a minimum of 48 hours for this procedure? Patterson looked at the log, looked at the men staring at him. He'd known this moment would come eventually. The math was too obvious. Ships don't build themselves in half the time without someone changing something. He could lie, claim a clerical error, blame the foreman who recorded the times, plead ignorance of the specifications. That's what most workers would do: deflect, minimize, survive. Instead, Patterson told the truth. Because 48 hours is too long, the metal doesn't need it. Morrison's expression didn't change. The Bureau of Ships employs naval architects with decades of experience. They determined that procedure requires 48 hours for structural integrity reasons. Are you suggesting they're wrong? I'm saying the metal doesn't care what the manual says. I'm saying if you sequence the welds correctly, use sympathetic heating, the stresses cancel out. You don't need the cooling periods. The joint's actually stronger. The room went very quiet. The commander from Washington, Captain Richard Dort, though Patterson didn't learn his name until later, leaned forward. Mr. Patterson, are you aware that unauthorized modification of approved construction sequences is grounds for immediate dismissal and potential criminal charges under the War Powers Act? Patterson said he was. Then why did you do it? Patterson's answer, recorded by the stenographer and preserved in Bureau of Ships memorandum dated April 16, 1942. Because the boys at sea need ships more than they need paperwork, sir. And because I've been welding 20 years, and I know when metal's fighting me and when it's working with me. Your manual fights the metal. My way works with it. Captain Dort opened the metallurgical test results. These were not routine inspections. After Nicholas's impossibly fast completion, the Navy had extracted core samples from 12 different weld points across the hull. They'd subjected them to tensile strength testing, impact resistance analysis, fatigue cycle simulation, and microscopic crystalline structure examination. The tests were designed to find the hidden weaknesses, the shortcuts that would kill sailors when a torpedo struck or a depth charge detonated nearby. The results showed something unexpected. Patterson's welds weren't just adequate, they exceeded specification requirements. The tensile strength averaged 11% higher than regulation welds. The impact resistance critical for surviving combat damage showed 13% improvement. Most significantly, the fatigue testing suggested Patterson's technique created more uniform stress distribution across the joint, reducing the likelihood of stress crack formation over time. Dort read these numbers aloud. Then he asked the question that would change American naval production. If we gave you complete authority over welding procedures, if we removed all time restrictions and let you train a full crew in your methods, how fast could you build a destroyer? Patterson thought for a moment. He'd been doing mental calculations for months, watching the construction timeline, identifying every bottleneck created by mandatory cooling periods and sequential procedures. He'd never had permission to test his theory at full scale, but he knew what was possible. Give me 60 welders I can train personally. Give me free hand with sequencing and let your inspectors test the finished work instead of watching every procedure. I can cut 2 months off the current production time, maybe more. Dort looked at the calendar on the wall. April 14th, 1942. In the Pacific, American forces were retreating everywhere that mattered. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore had fallen. The Dutch East Indies had fallen. Japanese forces controlled everything from Burma to the Solomon Islands. The only thing slowing their advance was logistics and the U.S. Navy's shrinking ability to interdict Japanese supply lines. The Navy needed destroyers, needed them desperately, needed them in quantities that conventional construction methods couldn't provide in time to matter. Dort made a decision that violated every institutional instinct the Navy possessed. He looked at Patterson and said, "You have 45 days to prove it. We're assigning you USS Fletcher, DD 445. Assemble your crew, train them, build the ship your way. If it passes structural certification, we'll revise the procedures. If it fails, if there's any indication of compromised integrity, you'll face charges. Do you understand?" Patterson understood. What happened next wasn't just about welding technique. It was about whether a century and a half of institutional knowledge could adapt fast enough to meet a crisis that didn't care about proper procedure. USS Fletcher, DD 445. Keel laid April 20th, 1942. Patterson assembled 68 welders. Not the fastest workers, the smartest ones. Men who understood metal intuitively, who could see the stress patterns before the metal showed them, who'd spent enough years in steel mills to know when the book was right and when the book was theoretical nonsense written by people who'd never held a torch. He spent 3 days teaching them, not procedures, principles. How metal flows under heat, how simultaneous welding on opposite sides of a joint creates balanced thermal expansion. How you can use the metal's tendency to warp as a tool instead of fighting it. How stress patterns propagate through a structure, and how you can choreograph dozens of welds so the stresses cancel each other out like sound waves in perfect destructive interference. Most of the welders grasped it immediately. They'd all seen the same things Patterson had seen, welds that held when they shouldn't, failures that happened despite perfect technique, metal that behaved differently than the engineering tables predicted. They'd just never had permission to act on that knowledge. On April 23rd, Patterson's crew began work on Fletcher's hull. The Navy's construction manual specified building a destroyer in sequential phases. Complete the keel structure, then add hull plating bow to stern, then build up the superstructure deck by deck, then install engines and machinery, then weapons systems, then electronics. Each phase waiting for the previous phase to complete. Each phase including mandatory cooling and settling periods. Patterson threw out the sequence. His crew worked on 6 sections simultaneously. Forward hull plating while stern frames were still being assembled. Superstructure while the engine room was being fitted. Gun mounts while the bridge was being constructed. Radar masts while ammunition hoists were being installed. To a traditional shipbuilder, it looked like chaos. Dozens of welders working in apparent randomness. No clear progression from bow to stern or bottom to top. But there was a pattern. Patterson had mapped every weld in the ship and calculated the thermal stress each one would create. He'd sequenced them so that as one section expanded under heat, another section contracted. As stress built up in one area, it was relieved by corresponding stress in another. The entire ship became a single, choreographed heat cycle. The Navy inspectors watched, waited for catastrophe. The metal would warp, the hull would twist, the joints would crack under uneven stress, the ship would be structurally compromised, a floating coffin that would break apart the first time it fired its guns at battle speed. None of that happened. The metal did exactly what Patterson said it would do. The stresses cancelled, the joints held. And on June 2nd, 1942, 43 days after the keel was laid, USS Fletcher was launched. 137 days ahead of the contracted schedule, the Bureau of Ships subjected Fletcher to every test they could devise. They loaded the ship to maximum combat displacement and ran high-speed maneuvers. They fired the main guns at maximum elevation while executing hard turns. They simulated depth-charge shock by detonating underwater explosives at measured distances. They flexed the hull by deliberately running through heavy seas. They stressed the superstructure by loading every weapons station simultaneously. Fletcher didn't just pass. It outperformed destroyers built using traditional methods. The hull showed less flexing under load. The superstructure exhibited fewer stress indicators. The weapons mounts held tighter alignment. On June 19, 1942, the Bureau of Ships issued Technical Directive 42-118. Revised construction sequencing for Fletcher-Class destroyers authorized use of simultaneous welding techniques based on sympathetic stress distribution principles. Thomas Patterson's illegal method became official United States Navy policy. The cascade happened faster than anyone anticipated. Bath Iron Works in Maine received the revised technical directive on June 22. Their chief engineer, a man named Robert Allen, who'd been building ships for 30 years, read it 3 times. Then he called the Bureau of Ships in Washington to confirm this wasn't a clerical error. It wasn't. Allen spent 2 weeks training his welders in Patterson's technique. By mid-July, Bath Iron Works had cut their destroyer production time from 163 days to 141 days. By September, 119 days. Bethlehem Steel's shipyard in San Francisco received the directive on June 25. Their initial reaction was skepticism. Simultaneous welding violated everything they'd been taught about preventing thermal distortion. But the Bureau of Ships wasn't making suggestions. It was issuing mandatory procedures. Bethlehem trained their crews. By August, their production time dropped from 157 days to 128 days. By October, 103 days. Consolidated Steel in Orange, Texas, Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding in Washington, Boston Navy Yard, Norfolk Navy Yard, Mare Island. Every major facility building Fletcher-Class destroyers received the directive and retrained their workers. The results were staggering. In calendar year 1942, using traditional sequential construction methods, American shipyards completed 19 Fletcher-Class destroyers. In calendar year 1943, using Patterson's techniques, they completed 71. In 1944, 112. By the end of the war, 175 Fletcher-Class destroyers had been commissioned. But the numbers alone don't capture the impact. What matters is timing. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons, August 1942. The U.S. Navy deployed 7 destroyers. 3 had been built using traditional methods. 4 had been built using Patterson's accelerated techniques, ships that wouldn't have existed yet under the old timeline. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944. The U.S. Navy fielded 23 destroyers. 14 of them were ships that had been completed ahead of the traditional construction schedule, ships that existed because Thomas Patterson had questioned whether 48 hours was really necessary. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 1944. 38 destroyers, 22 ahead of schedule ships. 22 ships crewed by sailors who would have been waiting for vessels that hadn't been built yet. By Okinawa, in April 1945, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had numerical superiority over the Imperial Japanese Navy of approximately 3-to-1 in destroyer tonnage. This ratio would have been impossible under traditional construction timelines. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who commanded amphibious operations across the Pacific, wrote in his post-war analysis, "The accelerated production of destroyers between 1943 and 1945 constituted the single most important logistical factor enabling simultaneous multi-theater operations. Without this production surge, we would have lacked the screening vessels necessary to protect both carrier task forces and amphibious groups, forcing sequential rather than concurrent campaigns and extending the war's duration by an estimated 12 to 18 months. 12 to 18 months. Thousands of additional casualties, billions in additional costs, all prevented because a Pennsylvania welder looked at a manual and thought, there has to be a better way. But there's another dimension to this story that rarely gets examined. Patterson's innovation didn't just accelerate production, it revealed something uncomfortable about how the Navy, how any large organization processed knowledge. The traditional shipbuilding procedures weren't stupid. They were based on genuine experience and sound engineering principles developed over decades. Senior naval architects understood metallurgy, structural mechanics, thermal dynamics. They designed successful ships for generations. Their methods produced reliable vessels that survived combat and served for years. What they didn't have was the kind of knowledge that comes from standing in front of molten metal every day for 20 years. The tactile understanding of how heat flows through steel, the visual recognition of stress patterns forming in real time, the intuitive sense of when metal is cooperating and when it's fighting you. This type of knowledge, sometimes called tacit knowledge by organizational theorists, can't be transmitted through manuals. It exists in the hands and eyes of people doing the work, and it's routinely dismissed by institutional hierarchies because it can't be quantified, tested, or reduced to written procedures. Patterson possessed knowledge the naval architects didn't have, but the institutional structure assumed that formal engineering education trumped practical experience, that the people designing ships knew more than the people building them. That wisdom flowed from the top down, never from the bottom up. The crisis of 1942 temporarily shattered this assumption. Desperate necessity created a brief window where someone actually asked a welder whether the approved method was actually the best method, and it turned out the welder knew something the engineers didn't. But here's what haunts the story. How many other innovations never happened because the person who knew better wasn't allowed to try? How many welders, machinists, electricians, and technicians saw more efficient methods and stayed silent because the manual said otherwise? How many ships got built slowly because organizational hierarchy valued credentials over competence? Patterson got lucky. He worked second shift when inspectors were scarce. He had a superintendent willing to look the other way. He made his breakthrough at exactly the moment when military desperation outweighed bureaucratic caution. And even then, he nearly faced criminal charges. The real question isn't why Patterson succeeded. It's why the system that nearly stopped him remained essentially unchanged. When the Bureau of Ships issued Technical Directive 42-118, they didn't just approve Patterson's methods, they standardized them. They created new manuals, new training protocols, new inspection procedures. Patterson's flexible, intuitive understanding of metal stress became rigid doctrine. This was probably inevitable. The Navy needed to scale the technique across dozens of shipyards employing tens of thousands of welders. Standardization was necessary, but something got lost in translation. Patterson understood the principles behind his technique. He could adapt his approach based on specific conditions: the ambient temperature, the grade of steel, the thickness of the plate, the position of the weld. He made constant micro-adjustments based on how the metal was behaving in that moment. The standardized manual couldn't capture this flexibility. It specified sequences, temperatures, torch angles, cooling times. It reduced Patterson's intuition to a checklist, which meant when welders encountered situations that didn't fit the standard procedure, they were back to the original problem: rules that didn't match reality. By late 1943, Patterson was receiving letters from shipyard workers across the country. They'd been trained in his technique, but they were encountering problems the manual didn't address. Different steel alloys behaving differently, unusually cold weather affecting cooling rates, structural configurations that didn't match the standard blueprints. They wanted Patterson to tell them what to do. He wanted them to think about the principles and adapt. Most of them couldn't. They'd been trained to follow procedures, not to understand metal. They wanted steps, not comprehension. The Navy wanted predictable results, not individual judgment. Patterson spent evenings writing responses, trying to teach principles through correspondence, trying to explain that the manual was a guide, not gospel. That metal would tell you what it needed if you paid attention. That the point wasn't to follow his specific sequence, it was to understand why the sequence worked, so you could modify it when conditions changed. Very few of them got it. The manual had created a new orthodoxy, just as rigid as the old one. Patterson's specific innovation had been adopted. The thinking behind it, the willingness to question approved methods, hadn't. By 1944, Federal Shipbuilding had refined Patterson's technique even further. They were completing Fletcher-Class destroyers in an average of 17 days from keel laying to launch. 17 days. What had taken 5 to 6 months in 1941 now took 2.5 weeks. The yard had become a precision instrument, multiple destroyers in various stages of construction, each section carefully timed so that as one ship launched, another's keel was being laid, another's superstructure was going up, another's weapons were being installed. The entire yard operated as a single, choreographed production system. Patterson had been promoted to shift supervisor, then to technical consultant. The Navy had offered him a civilian position in the Bureau of Ships come to Washington, teach the technique at the national level, help standardize training across all naval construction. He declined. He preferred the shipyard floor, preferred working with metal to working with bureaucrats, but he wasn't welding anymore. His job now was troubleshooting, traveling between workstations, solving problems, showing younger welders how to read the metal. It was necessary work. It wasn't the same. In February 1945, Patterson was welding again, not because he had to, because a particularly difficult joint, a stress point where the hull met the superstructure at an unusual angle, was giving 3 different welders trouble. The metal kept warping despite following the approved procedure. Patterson watched them try, watched the metal misbehave, and finally took the torch himself. He didn't follow the procedure. He sequenced the welds differently, adjusting on the fly based on how the metal was responding. 7 minutes later, the joint was perfect. One of the younger welders asked him why he'd deviated from the manual. "Because the metal told me to," Patterson said. "But what if an inspector sees?" Patterson looked at him. "Then you explain that the metal matters more than the paperwork. That's the whole point. That's what I've been trying to teach you." The welder nodded, but Patterson could see he didn't really understand. He'd follow the approved procedure next time, because the procedure was safe, because questioning it was risky. Because Patterson was Patterson, he had the authority to break rules. Regular welders didn't. Patterson realized, in that moment, that his real innovation hadn't been transferred. The technique had, the attitude hadn't. August 15th, 1945. Japan surrendered. Federal Shipbuilding had 2 Fletcher-Class destroyers in mid-construction. USS Timmerman, DD-828, was 63% complete. USS Haverfield, DD-845, was 41% complete. Both contracts were immediately cancelled. All work stopped within hours of the surrender announcement. Patterson stood on the shipyard floor, watching cutting torches dismantle Haverfield's partially completed hull. All that steel, all that work, all that innovation reduced to scrap metal in a single afternoon. The ship would never sail, never see combat, never protect anything. Someone asked him how he felt about it. "Better than finishing them," Patterson said. "Means we don't need them anymore." But watching the torches cut through those welds, some of them his own, Patterson felt something he hadn't expected. Not pride in what he'd accomplished, not satisfaction at the war's end, something closer to vertigo. Half years, speed had been everything. Build faster, launch faster, get ships to the Pacific faster. Every day saved meant American sailors had better protection, better odds, better chances of coming home. The urgency had justified everything, the rule-breaking, the risk-taking, the constant pressure to push harder. Now, suddenly, speed didn't matter. The ships weren't needed. The techniques he'd developed, the training programs he'd created, the entire production system that had consumed his life since 1942, all of it obsolete in the space of a radio announcement. Federal Shipbuilding and Drydock Company scaled back operations within weeks. The workforce that had peaked at 14,000 in early 1945 dropped to 6,000 by October, 3,000 by December. Patterson received 2 weeks' notice in late August. His services were no longer required. The Navy sent a commendation letter thanking him for his contributions to the war effort. No pension, no continued employment, no recognition beyond a single paragraph on official letterhead. Patterson returned to Pittsburgh in September 1945. He was 47 years old. He had 17 days severance pay and a reputation as the man who'd revolutionized destroyer production. The reputation didn't help him find work. Steel mills weren't hiring, everyone was laying off. The shipyards were closing. The industrial economy was contracting as war production ceased. He eventually found work at a machine shop in East Liberty, welding commercial refrigeration units. Steady work, decent pay, nothing like the urgency and scale of wartime shipbuilding, but enough to live on. Patterson worked there until he retired in 1967. He died in 1973, age 75, of emphysema, an occupational disease common among welders who'd spent decades breathing metal fumes. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned his work during the war in a single sentence. It didn't mention the 17-day destroyers, didn't mention the technique that had changed naval construction, didn't mention that his innovation had potentially shortened the Pacific War by more than a year. The Navy didn't send representatives to his funeral. The Bureau of Ships didn't issue a statement. The shipyards he'd helped transform had long since closed or converted to commercial work. Thomas Patterson was remembered by his family and former co-workers as a skilled craftsman who'd done his part during the war. That was all. But Patterson's story doesn't end with his death, because the question his work raised, whether the people doing the work might know something the people designing the work don't, remains unanswered. Modern industrial management has created entire disciplines around this question. Continuous improvement programs, lean manufacturing techniques, worker empowerment initiatives. Organizations claim to value bottom-up innovation, to listen to frontline employees, to embrace ideas regardless of where they originate in the hierarchy. But the structural dynamics haven't fundamentally changed. Procedures are still written by engineers and followed by workers. Innovation still requires formal approval through institutional channels. Questioning established methods still carries risk less extreme than potential criminal charges, perhaps, but risk nonetheless. Consider the parallels. In modern software development, programmers routinely discover more efficient methods that violate coding standards. In manufacturing, assembly workers identify shortcuts that quality assurance managers consider inappropriate. In healthcare, nurses develop patient care techniques that differ from official protocols. In every case, the institutional response is similar. Prove it works, get approval, go through channels. Sometimes this is appropriate. Not every innovation is actually an improvement. Some shortcuts create hidden problems. Some rule-breaking leads to catastrophic failure. Institutions need procedures for good reasons. But Patterson's story suggests a different problem. What happens when the procedures themselves become the goal? When following the manual becomes more important than achieving the manual's purpose? When the question, "Does this work?" gets replaced by, "Does this comply?" The Navy's shipbuilding procedures in 1941 were designed to produce reliable ships. That was the goal. The sequential welding, the cooling periods, the careful phasing, all of it served that purpose. But at some point, the procedures became disconnected from their purpose. They became rules to follow, not methods to question. Patterson reconnected means and ends. He asked, "What are we actually trying to accomplish? Build strong ships, fast. Everything else is negotiable." This seems obvious. It wasn't. Organizations rarely operate on first principles. They operate on precedent, procedure, and accumulated practice. Most of the time, this works fine. But when circumstances change, when the world demands something different than what the procedures were designed to produce, institutions struggle to adapt. Patterson succeeded because the crisis was existential enough to override institutional inertia. The Navy needed destroyers more than it needed procedural compliance. But this raises the uncomfortable question: how many innovations never happen because the crisis isn't quite desperate enough? How many improvements remain undiscovered because questioning the manual carries more risk than following it? The final irony of Patterson's story is this: his innovation was simultaneously revolutionary and conservative. Revolutionary because it overturned decades of established practice. Conservative because it didn't abandon the goal, it just found a better way to achieve it. Patterson wasn't arguing against building strong ships. He was arguing for building strong ships faster. This is the pattern of most genuine innovation. It's not about destroying the old system. It's about taking the system's goals seriously enough to question whether the current methods actually serve those goals optimally. But organizations punish this kind of thinking. Because questioning methods implies that previous generations were wrong, because changing procedures requires admitting that the current procedures are suboptimal, because allowing workers to modify approved methods creates unpredictability, and organizations crave predictability. So we get the paradox. Organizations claim to value innovation while structurally preventing it. They want new ideas, but only through approved channels. They want improvement, but only if it doesn't disrupt existing procedures. They want workers to think, but only about how to better implement predetermined methods. Patterson broke through this paradox because he had no choice. The alternative was watching American sailors die for lack of ships, but he almost didn't break through. He came within hours of being dismissed, potentially prosecuted, definitely silenced. The question remains: how many other Thomas Pattersons exist in every organization, every institution, every industry? People who see better ways but stay silent because the risk of speaking up outweighs the reward? People who know the manual is wrong but follow it anyway because deviating carries consequences? We'll never know. By definition, we can't know. Innovations that never happen leave no trace. Ideas that never get tested don't enter the historical record. Knowledge that stays tacit because speaking up is too dangerous remains forever unexamined. What we know is this: Thomas Patterson's innovation saved time, resources, and lives. But he almost didn't get the chance to prove it, and when he did, the system adopted his technique while ignoring the larger lesson that sometimes the people doing the work know something the people writing the manuals don't. Years later, we still haven't learned that lesson. We still build organizations that value credentials over competence, procedure over performance, compliance over results. We still assume that wisdom flows from the top down. We still rarely ask the people holding the tools whether there might be a better way. Patterson proved there was. The destroyers that won the Pacific War are evidence. 175 Fletcher-Class ships, built faster than anyone thought possible, sailing into combat years before traditional methods would have produced them, all because one inspector asked a welder why instead of just telling him to stop. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.